Silence was the first and most profound lesson of the Grey Knights. Brother-Captain Valerian knew this truth in the marrow of his transhuman bones, a truth etched into him during the long, cold nights of his initiation on Titan. He sat in the stark, unadorned cell that had been his place of meditation for decades, his massive form armored in ceramite and resolve. Yet his mind was a fortress sailing the turbulent, starless sea of the Empyrean. His breathing was a slow, measured rhythm, a biological metronome counting out the seconds of an eternal vigil. It was in this profound quiet that the memories surfaced, not as distractions, but as foundational stones of his being. He remembered the agony of his creation. The pain was not merely physical, though the genetic sculpting and organ implantation had been a trial of fire and blood. It was the psychic indoctrination that had truly unmade and remade him. His mind, once a vulnerable thing of flesh and fleeting thought, had been reforged into a weapon. They had flooded his consciousness with the most hideous arcana, the true names of demons, the geometries of corruption, the scent of a soul rotting from within. He had learned to stand firm against psychic onslaughts that would shatter a world, to gaze into the heart of the warp and not blink. And with that knowledge came the oath, sworn on the blade of his mentor and sealed in blood and soul. An oath of eternal secrecy. The Imperium could not know of the horrors they fought, for knowledge itself was a vector for the enemy. They were the hidden shield, the unsung wardens whose victories were buried in silence and whose very existence was a state secret. A tremor, faint as a spider's step on glass, shivered through the immaterium. Valerian's eyes beneath his closed helm did not open, but his entire awareness sharpened, focusing on that subtle wrongness. It was a familiar dread, a cold pressure building behind reality's thin veil. It was the herald of a mission, the psychic stench of a breach that required their specific, purifying touch. This sensation was the true constant of his life, the reason for the vigil. This knowledge was his isolation. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with battle brothers from other chapters, seen the fervent faith of the Imperial Guard, and heard the zealous proclamations of the ecclesiarchy. They fought bravely, but they fought shadows. They did not comprehend the true, sentient malevolence that lurked behind the veil, the cosmic predators that fed on faith and despair. They could not know the chilling intelligence in a demon's gaze, the way it could unspool a man's history and use his deepest regrets against him. This burden of truth was his alone, shared only with his brothers. It was a weight that no other human, no matter how heroic, could ever be asked to bear. To know was to be forever set apart, a lone sentinel on a rampart overlooking an infinite, screaming dark. The vigil was not merely a practice, it was the entirety of his existence, a state of being poised forever on the edge of the abyss, ready to leap into its heart at a moment's notice. The tremor in the warp grew stronger, a dissonant chord plucked on the strings of fate, and Valerian knew his solitude was about to be interrupted by fire and duty. The chime that shattered the silence of his cell was not a sound, but a psychic impulse, a command etched directly into his consciousness. It carried the unmistakable authority of Grand Master Mordrak, a presence in the warp as solid and unyielding as the bedrock of Titan itself. Brother-Captain Valerian rose, his Aegis armor purring with latent power as servos and actuators adjusted to his movement. The stone floor of the chamber felt cold even through his armored boots, a grounding sensation before he stepped back into the endless war. The door to his cell slid open without a whisper, revealing the stark, adamantium-lined corridors of the fortress monastery. Here, the air hummed with suppressed psychic energy, a testament to the 10,000 souls within who were weapons first and men second. He moved through the labyrinthine passages, his footsteps echoing with a grim finality. Other gray knights passed him, their own helmed heads nodding in silent acknowledgement. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The summons was felt by all who were attuned, a ripple of impending action in the calm pool of their vigil. They were a brotherhood bound by more than oaths. They were a single, multifaceted will honed for a singular, terrible purpose. Valerian's mind, however, remained fixed on the tremor he had felt, the psychic spore of a wound in reality. He began running tactical assessments, calculating potential threats, the possible vectors of corruption. This was the prelude to violence, a quiet calculus of annihilation. The doors to the Grand Master's stratagem were vast slabs of obsidian, inlaid with silver wards that glowed with a soft, purifying light. They swung inward as he approached, revealing a chamber that was more temple than command center. Hololithic projectors cast shifting schematics of star systems into the air, but the dominant feature was the great oculus that showed the swirling, hypnotic void of the warp itself. Grand Master Mordrak stood before it, his own ornate armor seeming to drink the light from the room. He was a monument of a man, his presence a psychic anchor that stabilized the very air. He did not turn as Valerian entered, his gaze fixed on the chaotic tapestry of the immaterium. The briefing was telepathic, a swift, brutal download of information that bypassed the fallibility of speech. Images flooded Valerian's mind, a frontier world on the edge of the segmentum obscurus, Veridia. A verdant agri world, now bleeding a psychic scream into the warp. Sensor ghosts, missing pilgrim ships, and then the confirmed data, a daemonic incursion, signature consistent with a minor warp rift. The mission parameters were seared into his consciousness with chilling clarity. Investigate the source. Assess the level of planetary corruption. Purge any and all taint. And the final grim authorization, a weapon of last resort that hung in the psychic space between them like a shard of ice. The right of exterminatus, the complete and total sterilization of a world. The death of a planet to save a sector. The weight of that potential duty settled on Valerian's shoulders, a familiar and terrible burden. He turned and left the stratagem, the Grand Master's silent, unyielding expectation a greater impetus than any shouted order. His destination was the arming chambers. His battle brothers were already assembling, drawn by the same psychic call. He saw veterans with armor scarred by ethereal flames, their psychic auras calm and focused like tempered steel. And he saw the younger ones, their eagerness a sharp, bright blade not yet tested against the true horrors of the warp. Among them was Initiate Kalen, his armor still gleaming with the unmarked purity of one who had not yet faced the ultimate test of his faith. Valerian stood before them, his gaze sweeping across the squad. He pulsed a single, powerful psychic thought, a wave of intent that captured their absolute attention. He impressed upon them the gravity of Veridia. This was not a war for territory or resources. It was a surgery, a cauterization of a festering wound in reality itself. He showed them in a shared flash of psychic insight the consequences of failure, not merely military defeat, but the unraveling of sanity, the birth of a demon world, the loss of billions of souls to an eternity of torment. He looked directly at Kalen, impressing upon the young initiate the true cost of their duty. There was no glory here, only necessity. There was no fame, only secrecy. There was no compromise, only purity. Their nemesis force weapons were ignited in unison, a chorus of blazing silver light and humming power that filled the chamber. A silent vow made in the face of the coming dark. The summons had been answered. The purge was beginning. The transition into the warp was not a sound, but a scream, a silent, psychic shriek that tore at the edges of reality. The sanctuary of light shuddered, its gellar field flaring into a shimmering bubble of tortured physics that held the raw stuff of the Empyrean at bay. Outside the armored viewports, the stardusted blackness of the void dissolved into a seething, impossible kaleidoscope. Colors that had no name bled into one another, forming landscapes of screaming faces and cities of bone that bloomed and died in the space of a heartbeat. Time itself became a suggestion, a fluid thing that stretched and compressed around the vessel's fragile shell. Within the stratagem, Brother-Captain Valerian stood at the center of a circle of his battle brothers, their silvered armor reflecting the chaotic light of unreality. Their minds were joined, a single, blazing bastion of will in the formless chaos. Valerian was the anchor, his consciousness a bedrock of pure intent around which their combined psychic power coalesced. He did not chant or gesture. His will was the command. He wove intricate patterns of warding, silver threads of psychic energy that reinforced the gellar field, patching weak points as the warp's relentless pressure sought any flaw, any crack in their mental armor. The air in the chamber hummed with power, thick with the scent of ozone and sanctified incense, a pocket of order in an ocean of madness. For Initiate Kaelin, stationed at the edge of the circle, the experience was a baptism of fire. The psychic choir's unified focus was a distant lighthouse, its beam barely piercing the storm raging in his own mind. This was his first passage through the immaterium, and the theoretical indoctrination on Titan had done nothing to prepare him for the visceral, soul-scouring reality of it. The demonic whispers began not as sounds, but as insidious thoughts. That felt like his own. They showed him fleeting, horrific visions, his mentor's face melting into a mask of weeping sores, the fortress monastery on Titan crumbling into dust, his own hands clawing at the eyes of his brothers. A cold dread, entirely separate from the ship's environmental systems, seeped into his bones. He felt a presence, vast and hungry, pressing against the edges of his sanity. It promised him power, showing him visions of himself as a grand master, leading legions not in secrecy, but in glorious, open conquest. It whispered the true names of demons, offering them to him like keys to untold kingdoms. Then it shifted, showing him the alternative, the agonizing failure of their mission, the demonic horde spilling into the heart of the Imperium, all because he was too weak to hold the line. The whispers were a psychic acid, testing the integrity of his mental fortifications, probing for the doubts and fears he had buried during his training. His knuckles were white, where he gripped his force halberd, his breath coming in sharp, controlled gasps. He focused on the litanies of purity, on the image of the Emperor's light, but the warp sought to extinguish that light, to drown it in a tide of despair and temptation. He was a gray knight, a warrior bred and trained for this very war, and here, in the heart of the enemy's domain, he faced the terrifying truth that his greatest battle would always be fought within the confines of his own soul. The placid chaos of the warp shattered. The sanctuary of light was seized by an invisible fist, its gellar field groaning under a pressure that threatened to pulp the vessel into metaphysical slurry. The serene, if horrifying, vistas of shifting color and form outside the viewports vanished, replaced by a roiling, imperial tempest. This was no mere current. It was a warp storm, a hurricane of pure, sentient malice. Lightning the color of infected wounds arced across the void, striking the gellar field with concussive force that resonated through the ship's adamantium bones. The whispers in Kaelin's mind became a chorus of shrieks, the temptations turning to outright assault. The psychic presence he had felt now felt him in return, and it focused its boundless hunger upon his flickering soul light. Valerian's voice, though unuttered, cut through the psychic bedlam like a blade. His command was not a request but a fundamental restructuring of their collective will. The circle of gray knights tightened, their combined psychic aura flaring from a steady beacon into a miniature sun of silver fire. They were no longer merely reinforcing the Gellar field. They were becoming an extension of it, a bastion of pure thought against the storm's mind-breaking fury. Valerian stood immovable. His own psychic might a bulwark against which the waves of insanity broke and receded. He felt the strain on his brothers, the sharp, pained spikes of effort from the younger members, Kalen most of all. The initiate's mental shields were fraying, his focus scattering like leaves in a gale. Valerian did not break his own concentration, but he extended a single, focused thread of his consciousness, a psychic lifeline that pierced the storm and found Kalen's beleaguered mind. He did not offer words of comfort, for there was no comfort to be had in the warp. Instead, he projected an image, a memory so foundational it was carved into the genetic memory of every Grey Knight. It was the moment of their final oath, the cold of Titan's deepest sanctum, the weight of the Force soared upon their shoulder, and the absolute, unshakable certainty of their purpose. He showed Kalen not how to block out the storm, but how to stand within it. He taught him to anchor his mind not in the shifting sands of emotion or the brittle armor of dogma, but in the bedrock of his own purity. The demons offered power and whispered of failure, but they could not comprehend a will that desired nothing they offered and feared nothing they threatened. Valerian guided the young initiate to find that core of self, that unassailable truth of his being, and to make it his fortress. The storm raged, but within Kalen, a new silence began to grow, a small, defiant calm in the heart of the hurricane. As swiftly as it had come, the storm passed. The shrieking chaos outside the viewports bled away, the violent colors softening back into the warp's more familiar, hypnotic swirl. The pressure on the Gellar field eased, and the psychic assault receded to its previous manageable whisper. The sanctuary of light shuddered once, a great beast shaking off a mortal blow, and then slipped from the immaterium back into the cold, clean blackness of real space. Before them hung Veridia. From this distance, it was a jewel of green and blue, a tranquil agri-world that should have been teeming with life, its orbital lanes buzzing with freighters and pilgrim ships. But the scanners told a different story. The auger arrays swept the planet, finding no energy signatures, no communication traffic, no engine burns in the void around it. There was only an eerie, profound silence, a void where the hum of a human civilization should have been. More telling was the psychic residue. Even across the vast gulf of space, the Grey Knights could feel it, a foul, greasy stain upon the planet's aura, the psychic scar of a recent, violent breach in reality. It was the silence of a graveyard and the stench of a demonic abattoir. The investigation was over before it had begun. The purgation was now inevitable. The silence of Veridia was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that smothered the world from orbit to surface. The sanctuary of light hung in the void like a silver dagger poised above a poisoned heart, its crew executing the landing protocols with a grim, ritualistic precision. Within the assault bay, the only sounds were the hiss of pressurization and the deep, resonant thrum of activated power armor. Brother-Captain Valerian stood immobile as his battle brothers secured the final components of his Aegis armor, the sacred plates locking into place with the finality of a tomb sealing. Each piece was inscribed with warding sigils that glimmered with a soft, internal light, a physical manifestation of their psychic fortitude. Around him, the rest of the squad performed the same rites, their movements economical and practiced. The air grew thick with the scent of sanctified oils and ozone, the atmosphere charging with the suppressed power of 8 psychic warriors preparing for war. The Thunderhawk gunship descended through the atmosphere on pillars of fire, its passage the only violence in an unnervingly still sky. Valerian watched the landscape resolve through the viewport. Verdant plains and lush forests sprawled beneath them, but the green was wrong, a sickly, jaundiced hue, as if the very chlorophyll was rotting. There were no signs of life, no birds in the air, no herds on the plains, no plumes of smoke from hearths or industry. The gunship banked, revealing their landing zone, a settlement designated as Outpost Tertius. It was not a ruin born of battle or natural decay. The structures were intact, their prefabricated shells gleaming dully in the muted light, but they were utterly deserted. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the whine of the Thunderhawk's engines as it settled onto the cracked permacrete of the central square. The ramp descended with a hydraulic sigh, revealing the ghost town. The Grey Knights disembarked in a perfect tactical spread, their armored boots striking the ground in near unison. Their enhanced senses took in every detail. The air was cold and carried the faint, metallic tang of blood and ozone, underpinned by a cloying sweetness that spoke of spiritual decay. The settlement was a monument to absence. Doors hung open on broken hinges, personal effects lay scattered in the streets as if dropped in mid-flight, and a child's toy, a small wooden cart, lay on its side, forgotten. It was Brother Sergeant Thuron who found the first mark. He gestured with his storm bolter towards the wall of a communal hab unit. Carved deep into the permacrete was a symbol, an A-tarot star whose lines seemed to writhe and twist if stared at for too long. The mark of chaos. It was not painted. It was gouged into the material with terrifying force, and from its grooves seeped a thin, black ichor that smelled of opened graves. More were found with every passing moment on water towers, on the sides of ground cars, even etched into the road itself. The entire settlement was a canvas for this profane graffiti, a testament to a population that had not just been killed, but systematically, ritualistically corrupted. Valerian raised a gauntleted fist, halting the squad's advance. He closed his eyes, his helmeted head tilting slightly as he cast his psychic awareness outwards, a sonar pulse in an ocean of silence. The echo that returned was not an absence but a presence. It was vast, ancient, and utterly malevolent. It coiled beneath the settlement, a serpent of pure hatred sleeping in the planet's core, its psychic spore so potent it made the air vibrate. He could feel its mind, a labyrinth of spite and cunning, aware of their presence and watching them with cold, infinite patience. This was no minor warp rift, no fleeting incursion. This was a foothold, a cancer that had already sunk its roots deep into Viridia's soul. His voice was a low, resonant pulse through the squad's vox beads, a sound that brooked no argument. He ordered the advance, caution paramount. In response, a chorus of soft, actinic hums filled the air as 8 Nemesis Force weapons flared to life. Blades, halberds, and hammers were sheathed in coruscating silver energy, their light pushing back the oppressive gloom and causing the chaotic symbols on the walls to smolder and recoil. The psychic flames reflected in the silver of their armor, turning each Grey Knight into a walking brazier of purifying fire. They moved forward, a wedge of argent resolve descending into the belly of a silent, waiting beast. The silence of the settlement was a lie. It was not the quiet of the dead, but the held breath of something waiting, watching from the deep shadows between the skeletal hab units. Brother-Captain Valerian led his squad through the deserted streets, their silver armor stark against the grim backdrop. The mark of chaos was everywhere, a profane scripture carved with frenzied purpose. The air grew colder, thick with a psychic residue that clung to their armor like cobwebs. It was Brother Kalen, his senses sharpened by his recent trial in the warp, who first detected the anomaly, a faint, dissonant hum of power emanating from beneath a collapsed administratum building, a structure that appeared no different from its neighbors save for the sheer density of the blasphemous symbols defiling its walls. With a gesture, Valerian directed brothers Thuron and Gideon to the rubble. Their enhanced strength made light work of the ferrocrete debris, clearing a path that revealed not solid ground, but a yawning, ragged hole descending into darkness. A foul, coppery stench billowed out, the unmistakable aroma of old blood and burnt flesh. Their helmet filters hissed as they engaged, but the psychic stench was far worse, a miasma of despair, pain, and rapturous devotion that was a physical pressure against their minds. They descended into the earth, the light from their armor and weapons pushing back a darkness that felt alive and hostile. The tunnel opened into a vast, subterranean chamber, a natural cavern expanded by crude tools and infernal will. The sight that greeted them was one of methodical, industrial-scale blasphemy. The cavern floor was a mosaic of dried blood, and at its center stood a series of altars hewn from black, volcanic rock. They were not simple slabs. Their surfaces were channeled with intricate grooves that all fed into a central sump, now filled with a congealed black substance that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. Scattered around the altars were the remains of the sacrifices, bones picked clean, some human, some unnervingly otherwise, arranged in precise, geometric patterns that hurt the eye to look upon. While the squad secured the perimeter, Valerian approached a makeshift workstation near the largest altar. It was a stark contrast to the primitive brutality of the chamber, housing a functioning data slate and a stack of leather-bound logs. The pages were not paper but flayed human skin, the writing upon them inscribed in a mixture of blood and ash. Valerian's mind, trained to process such horrors without flinching, deciphered the mad scribbles. They were logs, meticulous records of the cult's activities. Page after page detailed the increasing frequency and scale of the sacrifices, charting the growth of their psychic resonance. And then he found the true prize, the core of their damnable purpose. A dedicated log, its pages covered in complex ritual circles and equations that described a summoning of immense power. The name of the entity to be called forth was repeated like a mantra, a string of syllables that carried psychic weight. Xyrath, a demon prince of ancient and terrible lineage, a being of pure, strategic malice, a flicker of movement in the deepest shadows. Brother Thuron's storm bolter snapped up, its targeting laser painting a hunched figure trying to scramble behind a pillar. A single, precise shot from Gideon's silencer, set to a subsonic stun pulse, struck the figure in the back. It crumpled without a sound. They dragged the cultist into the flickering light of the altars. He was a wretched thing, emaciated and pale, his skin covered in self-inflicted scars that formed the same A-tarot star. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated not with fear but with a terrifying, zealous fervor. Valerian loomed over him, his psychic presence an immense weight that crushed the man's feeble mental defenses. He did not speak aloud. His will was the interrogation, a psychic probe that plunged into the cultist's mind, sifting through the madness and devotion like a miner panning for gold. The cultist convulsed, a thin line of drool leaking from his lips as his memories were forcibly unfolded. Valerian saw it all, the slow seduction of the planetary governor, the systematic corruption of the populace through promises of power and immortality, the grand design that was far more ambitious than a simple summoning. The sacrifices, the rituals, they were not to merely call Xyrath forth for a fleeting rampage. They were the key, the fuel for a permanent anchor. The cultist's mind, breaking under the strain, revealed the ultimate goal: to tear open a stable, permanent rift in the fabric of reality, a gateway through which the demonic legions of the warp could pour into the material universe unceasingly, turning Veridia from a graveyard into a demon world and a beachhead for an endless war. The investigation was over. They had found the cancer, and it was far more advanced and malignant than any of them had feared. The cultist's body arched, a violent spasm seizing his emaciated frame as if an invisible hand had reached inside him and twisted his spine. His mouth stretched wide in a silent, agonized scream, the zealous light in his eyes snuffing out, replaced by a profound, soul-deep terror. Before the Grey Knights could react, a foul, black vapor began to seep from his pores, his eyes, his gaping mouth, a tangible manifestation of demonic claim. The air grew thick with the stench of ozone and scorched meat as the vapor coalesced above his convulsing form, shaping itself for a fleeting second into a leering, inhuman visage that promised eternal torment. Then, with a sound like a dying sigh, the vapor dissipated, and the cultist's body collapsed into a lifeless husk, his soul ripped from its mortal coil and consigned to the ravenous entities he had worshipped. The interrogation was over, terminated by the very forces they sought to thwart. Brother-Captain Valerian stood unmoved, his gaze fixed on the empty shell. The cultist's final, traitorous thoughts had been a chaotic jumble of fear and fanaticism, but within that storm, Valerian had seized the crucial threads. He turned from the corpse, his mind a whirlwind of analysis, cross-referencing the madman's dying psychic impressions with the data from the flayed-skin logs. The clues were there, scattered like shards of a broken mirror, mentions of the spire, references to the planet's beating heart, and a recurring, almost worshipful focus on the capital city, Veridia Prime. The grand ritual was not meant for this forgotten outpost. This charnel house was merely a feeder, a tributary of pain channeled towards a far greater confluence of power. The central site, the nexus where Xyreth intended to force open his permanent gateway, was located in the heart of the planet's capital. He pulsed this revelation to the squad, a wave of grim certainty. The images of Veridia Prime's central spire, the Hive Spire, filled their minds, now recontextualized not as a monument to human endeavor, but as a potential fulcrum for the annihilation of an entire world. The path was clear, but the choice of how to walk it was a chasm opening before them. Brother Sergeant Thuron was the first to voice the tactical response, his psychic presence as direct and uncompromising as a storm bolter's burst. He projected the image of the sanctuary of light in high orbit, its lance batteries powering up. His argument was one of brutal, surgical logic. The capital was the heart of the infection. To enter it was to plunge into the belly of the beast, to risk their small squad being overwhelmed by a corrupted populace and a fully manifested demonic legion. The safer, surer path was purgation from afar, a concentrated orbital lance strike on the hive. Spire could potentially disrupt the ritual from a distance, collapsing the focus point and buying time for a more thorough, if still inevitable, exterminatus. Initiate Kaelin's psychic signature flared in immediate heated opposition. He projected not tactical schematics but faces, the imagined visages of the citizens of Veridia Prime. He conceded they were likely corrupted, their wills broken, their souls stained. But was there not a chance, however slim, that some remained pure, trapped, and helpless? To burn the city from orbit was to condemn every single one without a chance at redemption or a warrior's death. It was to become the very instrument of indiscriminate death they were sworn to prevent. He argued for infiltration, for a swift, precise assault on the ritual site itself. To banish Xyreth, to sever the demonic connection at its source, to save what could be saved. It was the path of hope, however desperate. The debate hung in the air, a silent war of philosophies waged. Between the silver giants, Valerian listened, weighing the cold calculus of extermination against the fiery, dangerous gamble of salvation. Thuron's way was clean, certain, and heavy with the weight of 1,000,000,000 anonymous deaths. Kaelin's way was noble, perilous, and heavy with the potential for a far greater catastrophe should they fail. There was no right answer, only choices steeped in shades of atrocity. The moral weight of their duty settled upon them all, a mantle of lead and fire. They were the judges of entire worlds, and the evidence before them pointed toward a verdict that would haunt the stars. The silence of the transit route to Viridia Prime was a predator's stillness, a held breath before the strike. The Grey Knights moved through the skeletal remains of an industrial sector, their silver armor ghostly in the gloom cast by Viridia's sickly, green-tinged sun. The grand, rusted carcasses of harvesters and cargo haulers lined the maglev track, creating a canyon of steel. And shadows. Brother-Captain Valerian's senses were stretched to their limit, every nerve screaming that the emptiness was a facade. The oppressive weight of the demonic presence was thicker here, a psychic miasma that clung to the rust and permacrete, a promise of violence waiting to be fulfilled. It was in the lee of a colossal grain silo, its metal skin scarred with the omnipresent A-Tarot star, that the promise was kept. The ambush did not begin with a roar, but with a whisper of displaced air and a sudden, gut-wrenching drop in temperature. The shadows between the machinery congealed, bubbling up from the ground like tar. From this seething darkness they emerged, lesser demons, a horde of clawed, bipedal horrors with flesh the color of a fresh bruise and eyes that burned with idiot malevolence. They were the foot soldiers of the warp, their forms barely holding cohesion, spitting acidic drool and wailing with a sound that was pure psychic dissonance, a weapon designed to shatter mortal minds. They flowed over the industrial debris in a tide of claws and fangs, their numbers seeming to boil forth from the very air. The Grey Knights did not break formation. They were a rock, and the demonic tide broke against them. Storm bolters roared, filling the canyon with deafening thunder, each mass-reactive shell punching through unnatural flesh with sanctified fury. Silencers hummed, their ethereal ammunition disrupting the demons' immaterial forms, causing them to flicker and scream as their essence was unspun. But the horde was endless, spilling from every shadowed crevice, their mindless hunger driving them forward into the storm of fire. Valerian stood at the apex of the kill zone, his nemesis force sword, Argent Vindicta, blazing in his hands like a sliver of captured lightning. He did not merely fight, he enacted a rite of purification. He became a conduit for the Emperor's wrath, his psychic power manifesting not as a shield, but as an all-consuming fire. He thrust his blade into the heart of the press, and a wave of purifying flame erupted from him, a silent, silver conflagration that did not burn with heat, but with absolute anathema to the unreal. Demons caught in its wake did not die. They unraveled. Their forms dissolved into screaming motes of black energy that were then snuffed into nothingness, banished back to the hell that had spawned them. With every sweep of his sword, with every focused pulse of his will, he erased a score of the creatures, his presence a blazing star of order in the chaotic dark. On the squad's left flank, where the maglev track met a collapsed warehouse, the press of demons was thickest. It was here that Initiate Kalen and Brother Sergeant Thuron held the line. Kalen's force halberd was a blur of silver energy, each precise strike severing a limb or piercing a distorted skull. He fought with the fierce, controlled grace of his training, every movement an affirmation of his purity. He proved his worth not with grand displays of power, but with unyielding resolve, a steadfast bulwark against the clawing, snapping tide. He protected Thuron's blind spot as the veteran fired controlled bursts into the swarm, their silent, symbiotic teamwork a testament to their brotherhood. But the warp is insidious. As Kalen parried a scything claw from one horror, another, lower to the ground, scuttled beneath his guard. Its touch was not a physical blow, but a psychic violation. A claw-tipped limb, shimmering with corrupting energy, raked across his armored greave. The ceramite did not break, but the demonic essence seeped through, a cold fire that bypassed armor and flesh to sink directly into his soul. A jolt of agonizing cold, far deeper than any physical wound, shot up his leg. Visions, foul and tempting, flickered at the edge of his consciousness. Whispers of the power he could wield if he just let go. Images of his brothers lying broken at his feet. He staggered, his halberd dipping for a crucial second. Thuron's storm bolter barked, reducing the offending demon to pulp. He moved to interpose himself between Kaelin and the horde, his own psychic aura flaring to cover the initiate's momentary weakness. The wound was not bleeding, but the armor around the point of impact was darkening, the silver finish tarnishing to a dull, bruised gray. The corrupting touch was a poison in Kaelin's system, a cold knot of alien malice that sought to unravel his sanctity from within. He gritted his teeth, the litanies of protection roaring in his mind, and forced his halberd back up, his strikes becoming more desperate, more ferocious. He had held the line, but the war for his soul had just acquired a new, deeply personal front. The demons kept coming, but the gray knights stood firm, their silver light a defiant beacon in the gathering dark. The spires of Viridia Prime clawed at a sky the color of a fresh bruise, a sprawling monument to human ambition now defiled by a far older, darker purpose. The Grey Knights breached the city's outer precincts, their advance a grim procession through avenues thick with the psychic residue of damnation. Here, the silence of the outlands was broken, not by the sounds of life but by a low, pervasive hum that vibrated through the permacrete and up into the marrow of their armored boots, the thrum of a reality under immense, unnatural strain. The air itself was thick and greasy, tasting of ozone, incense, and spilled viscera. The grand plazas and thoroughfares designed for millions were not empty. They were filled with a motionless, standing congregation. Thousands upon thousands of the city's citizens stood frozen in place, their faces upturned towards the city's heart, their eyes vacant pools of blackness. They were not dead but suspended, their life force being siphoned away in a continuous, silent stream, a river of stolen souls flowing towards a single, terrible destination. That destination dominated the horizon. Hive Spire, the planet's capital and tallest structure, was no longer a feat of human engineering. It had become an abomination. A colossal, swirling vortex of raw warp energy had been torn open at its peak, a wound in the fabric of the universe that pulsed with a sick, rhythmic light. Tendrils of impossible colors, violet, viridian, a gold that hurt to look at, lashed out from its core, caressing the city below like the limbs of some cosmic predator. The hum they felt was the sound of this rift, a dissonant chord played on the strings of reality, growing louder and more unstable with every passing second. Then something began to form within the heart of the maelstrom, a shape of pure shadow and malice, drawing substance from the torrent of stolen souls. Limbs of sculpted nightmare unfolded, vast and whip-thin. A crown of twisted horns erupted from a head that housed a single, burning eye of infinite spite. Wings of tattered reality, bleeding stars and screams, spread wide, casting a pall that dwarfed the spire itself. Xyrath, the demon prince, had not merely been summoned, he was being birthed, fully formed and immeasurably powerful, into the material world. His emergence was not an event, but an ongoing cataclysm, his very presence causing the laws of physics to weep and die in the air around him. Brother-Captain Valerian stood rooted, his enhanced senses and psychic awareness absorbing the full, horrifying scope of their failure. This was no mere incursion to be purged with bolter and blade. This was an apocalypse in its final, triumphant act. He activated his armor's long-range auspex, the scanner sweeping the city, and then the planet. The data that streamed across his retinal display was a death warrant for a world. The population metrics, once in the billions, were a cascading red zero. Biosigns were not absent. They were corrupted, their psychic waveforms twisted into screaming, chaotic patterns that were no longer human. The Auspex estimated 98% of Veridia's population had either been fully transformed into mindless cult thralls or had already been consumed as fuel for the rift in Xyrath's manifestation. The remaining 2% were likely in hiding, their pure souls mere morsels waiting to be devoured. There was no army to liberate, no populace to save. There was only a planet-sized battery, its energy almost spent, and a nearly born god of chaos ready to claim his new dominion. The realization struck Valerian with the force of a physical blow, a cold, sharp truth that bypassed his transhuman physiology and found the core of the man within the warrior. Exterminatus. The thought was a ghost that had haunted him since Grand Master Mordrak's briefing, but now it solidified into a dreadful, inescapable certainty. It was no longer an option of last resort. It was the only option that remained. To engage Xyrath now, in his seat of power, with his legions being birthed from the rift moment by moment, was not a battle, it was a futile, glorious suicide that would accomplish nothing but their own destruction and the demons' unopposed victory. The only way to sever the connection, to banish the demon prince and seal the rift, was to destroy the anchor point, to destroy Veridia itself. A conflict, silent and more violent than any demonic engagement, erupted within Valerian's soul. His duty, the very essence of his being as a Grey Knight, was to stand and fight, to purge the demonic with blade and fire until nothing remained. It was a sacred charge, a warrior's purpose. Yet here, his duty demanded the opposite. It demanded retreat. It demanded he become the instrument of a planet's death, the executioner of 1 billion souls already lost, to prevent a greater evil from spreading. The cost of this duty was not his life, which he would have given gladly. The cost was his purpose, his very identity. He was a protector, a purifier, a knight. To turn away from the fight, to condemn a world from orbit, felt like a profound betrayal of every oath he had ever sworn. The weight of the decision was a mountain on his shoulders, and in the hellish light of the burgeoning warp rift, Brother-Captain Valerian faced the terrible price of being the one who had to choose which atrocity would save the Imperium. The command bunker was a tomb of cold logic and colder truths, buried deep beneath the shrieking chaos of the city above. The air, recycled and sterile, did nothing to cleanse the psychic stench of the apocalypse unfolding on the surface. The only light came from the flickering hololithic display hovering above the central table, a rotating image of Veridia Prime with the hive spire rendered as a bleeding black vortex. Brother-Captain Valerian stood before it, his armored form a statue of silver and resolve, but within him, a war raged as fierce as any against the demonic. The Auspex data was irrefutable. The sight of Xyrath's emergence burned into his memory. He had gathered his squad in this last pocket of silence, not for a briefing, but for a council of executioners. He pulsed the grim totality of their situation into their minds, the near-total corruption of the populace, the stable warp rift, the fully manifesting demon prince. He laid out the two paths before them with the stark clarity of a headsman's axe. The hololith shifted, first showing a tactical schematic of an assault on the hive spire, a suicide run through a city of thralls and a sky full of demons. Then it shifted again, showing the cold, clean schematics of the sanctuary of light in high orbit, its cyclonic torpedo bays opening, its lance batteries powering for a world-killing strike. The squad's psychic aura, usually a unified bastion, fractured into sharp, conflicting currents. Brother Sergeant Thuron's mental voice was the first to cut through the silence, hard and pragmatic as adamantium. He projected not emotion, but a cascade of tactical data, enemy density estimates, Demonic manifestation. Gradients, the statistical probability of mission failure at near 100%. His argument was one of brutal necessity. A ground assault was a vainglorious gesture, a sacrifice that would achieve nothing but their own annihilation and leave Xyrath unopposed. The only strategic, the only responsible choice was immediate total purgation from orbit. To hesitate was to allow the cancer to metastasize beyond this single world, dooming entire sectors to a fate worse than death. He saw no souls left to save, only an infection to be cauterized. His viewpoint was echoed by several of the other veterans, their psychic signatures radiating a grim, weary agreement. They had seen this pattern before on other worlds and other screams. They knew the precise moment when salvation became a fool's hope and duty demanded the unthinkable. Then, a different light flared in the psychic space, young, bright, and burning with a desperate, defiant fire. It was Initiate Kaelin. He did not count with statistics, but with a single, powerful image. The Emperor not as a distant god, but as a beacon of hope for all mankind. He pushed against the tide of grim certainty, his psychic voice strained with the effort of holding his own corrupting wound at bay. He conceded the planet was damned, the populace lost. But was their duty only to destroy? Was there not a sliver of a chance, a fragment of hope, that a direct assault on the ritual's heart could sever the connection, banish Xyrath, and collapse the rift? To save even a handful of pure souls trapped in the horror, to offer the planet not just death, but the chance of a warrior's redemption. To burn it all from afar felt like surrendering to the despair the demons fed upon. It was a plea from the heart of the warrior he still aspired to be, a refusal to accept that sometimes the only way to win was to become the destroyer. The chamber was thick with the silent conflict, the two philosophies warring in the space between the 8 silver giants. All eyes, physical and psychic, turned to Valerian. He had remained silent, absorbing the arguments, feeling the weight of each word as if it were a world upon his shoulders. He turned from the hololith and looked at Kaelin. He did not dismiss the initiate's hope, for it was the very spark that had drawn him to the Grey Knights, the fire they fought to protect in all of humanity. But then Valerian's own psychic presence expanded, not with anger but with a profound, sorrowful finality. He did not project words but a memory, the same foundational memory he had shared with Kaelin in the warp storm. The cold sanctum on Titan. The weight of the Force soared on his shoulder. The oath sworn not to glory, not to hope, but to duty. An oath that acknowledged a terrible, necessary truth. He showed Kaelin and the entire squad the greater good, not as an abstract concept, but as the continued existence of the Imperium, the survival of countless untouched worlds, the billions of innocent souls who would never know the shadow that had passed over them. He made them feel the scale, the immense, crushing responsibility that demanded the sacrifice of one to save the multitude. His gaze held Kaelin's, and his final psychic thought was not a shout, but a quiet, unshakable truth that settled over them all like a shroud. Sometimes, the thought echoed in the silence of their minds, entire worlds must burn for the greater good. It was the core of their oath, the price of their power, the solitude of their knowledge. The hope for redemption was a luxury they could not afford. The dilemma was resolved. The path of the executioner was the only one that remained. The decision to burn was a cold star in Brother-Captain Valerian's soul, but the path to that final fire was paved with fury. There would be no retreat to orbit, not yet. The ritual's heart, the nexus of the warp rift, had to be struck. A direct assault was a suicide run, but a targeted one, a lance aimed at the beast's core to make the killing blow from space possible. They moved from the sterile silence of the bunker into the screaming chaos of the city's heart, the air itself vibrating with the birth screams of a demon world. The grand boulevards leading to the hive spire were no longer thoroughfares, but a river of damned humanity and boiling warp stuff. Thousands of cult thralls, their minds long since devoured, formed a living wall of fanatical flesh, their blank eyes fixed on the silver warriors as they chanted a single, discordant name that was a psychic weapon in itself, Zyrath. And between them, spilling from the distorted air, came the demons. They clawed their way into reality from the bleeding edges of the rift, a torrent of claw and fang and malice given form. Valerian led the wedge, a silver titan wading into a sea of blasphemy. His nemesis Force sword, Argent Vindicta, was not merely a weapon. It was an extension of his will, a sliver of absolute order. He did not swing it so much as guide it, its blade tracing arcs of incandescent silver that erased the unreal from existence. With every demon banished, with every cultist hewn apart, he chanted. Not aloud, for his voice was a weapon saved for greater foes, but in the sanctified space of his mind. The litanies of banishment, learned in the deepest vaults of Titan, were psychic constructs of immense power. They were not prayers of supplication, but declarations of absolute law, edicts of reality that stated, with unyielding finality, you are not, you cannot be, you are unmade. Each silent syllable was a hammer blow against the demonic essence, a reinforcement of the material world's fraying laws. The psychic feedback was a storm of agony. To wield such power in the heart of a nascent warp rift was to stand in the core of a star. Every banishment sent a concussive shockwave back through Valerian's soul, a backlash of pure spite from the Empyrean. It was a pressure that would have vaporized the mind of a mortal psyker, turning their brain to ash and their body to a puppet of the very forces they sought to defy. For Valerian and his brothers, it was a test of their superhuman endurance. Their aegis armor, inscribed with sacred wards, glowed white-hot, dispersing the ethereal fury. Beneath the ceramite, their enhanced biology worked in overdrive, neural pathways reforging themselves in microseconds, hyperdense sinews straining to contain the power they channeled. They were not just fighting demons. They were fighting the hostile physics of the space they occupied, their very presence a monumental act of will against the unraveling universe. The squad moved as a single, devastating organism. Storm bolters fired in controlled, thunderous bursts, each shell a tiny sun of purifying energy that detonated amidst the horde. Silencers hummed, their ethereal projectiles causing demons to flicker and distort, their forms destabilizing before being finished by a sweep of a force halberd or the crushing weight of a nemesis hammer. Initiate Kalen fought at Valerian's flank, his movements sharp, fueled by pain, and a desperate need to prove his captain's grim choice could still be met with valor. The corrupting touch on his leg was a cold fire spreading up his nervous system, a constant whisper of surrender, but he used it, turning the pain into a sharpened focus for his rage. His halberd was a blur, each strike a defiant negation of the darkness seeking to claim him. They were an island of silver in an ocean of filth and flame, their advance measured in meters paid for in spent shell casings and psychic toll. The ground shook not from their steps, but from the sheer density of the warp energy coiling around the spire. Demons of greater substance began to appear, hulking brutes of brass and flame that required the combined focus of multiple knights to dismantle. Valerian met one such beast, a creature of molten rage, and ended its existence with a single thrust of his blade. And a psychic command of such purity that the demon simply ceased, its form dissolving into a harmless, fading scream. He did not pause, his chanted litanies a constant, low thrum of power, a beacon of sanity in the maddened dark. The assault was a grinding, brutal testament to their purpose, a prelude to a greater sacrifice, each step forward a hammer blow on the anvil of a world destined for the fire. The inner sanctum was not a room, but a pocket of screaming unreality. The Grey Knights breached the final, warded archway and the world fell away. The floor became a swirling morass of captured souls, their faces pressing against an invisible barrier beneath their armored boots, mouths open in silent, eternal agony. The air was thick, not with smoke, but with coagulated malice, a psychic tar that sought to suffocate their very thoughts. And at the center of it all, standing before the pulsing, raw heart of the warp rift, was Zerath. The demon prince was a sculpture of living shadow. And blasphemy, his form both solid and terrifyingly fluid. His single, burning eye fixed upon Valerian, and the assault began not with a roar, but with a thought. The psychic duel was a war fought in a space with no dimensions. Zerath's mind was a fortress of ancient, curated hatred, its walls built from the despair of a million conquered worlds. He did not attack with brute force, but with insidious precision. He showed Valerian the future, not a future of failure, but of glorious absolute victory. Visions cascaded into the Brother-Captain's consciousness. Valerian, not as a hidden warden, but as a new Imperial saint, his silver armor gleaming at the head of a crusade that swept the galaxy clean of Xenos and heretic alike, his name sung on a billion worlds. The secrecy of the Grey Knights was revealed as a shackle, a limitation imposed by lesser minds fearful of their true potential. The power to make it real shimmered before him, offered by the very entity he had come to destroy. Valerian stood firm, his psychic defenses a fortress of pure intent. He drew upon the core of his being, the unassailable purity forged in the fires of Titan and tempered in countless unseen wars. The demon's promises were gilded poison, and he let them wash against the bedrock of his oath without finding purchase. He saw the visions for what they were, elegant traps, designed to appeal to the very desire for order and purpose that defined him. He countered not with denial, but with affirmation. He projected the cold, hard truth of his duty, the silent vigil, the unrecorded victories, the necessary atrocities. This was not a limitation, it was the highest calling. The glory Zerath offered was a hollow, fleeting thing, a crown of lies that would inevitably corrode into a collar of enslavement. Frustration, a hot, sharp emotion alien to such an ancient being, flickered within Zerath's psychic aura. The temptation of glory had failed, so he offered the temptation of knowledge. Visions shifted. Now Valerian saw the inner workings of the warp laid bare. He was shown the secret histories of the universe, the truths buried by the Imperium's dogmatic lies, the potential for understanding that could elevate humanity beyond its perpetual state of fear and war. Zerath whispered the true names of greater demons, the hidden geometries of the webway, the location of lost archaeotech that could save trillions. It was the ultimate seduction for a warrior scholar, the keys to a prison he had not known he was in. All he had to do was reach out and take it. For a single, perilous moment, the sheer scale of the offered knowledge threatened to overwhelm Valerian's defenses. The desire to know, to understand the horror he fought on a fundamental level, was a powerful, almost physical pull. It was the same drive that made him a master tactician, a student of the enemy. To have it all laid bare. The temptation was a cold blade against his soul, but as the secrets of the cosmos unfolded before him, he saw the hook within the bait. This knowledge was not freedom. It was a deeper, more absolute slavery. To know the warp so intimately was to be forever bound to it, to see its patterns in every star and every human heart, to live in a universe devoid of mystery and filled only with the cold, cruel machinery of the Empyrean. It was the death of hope, the end of faith. With a surge of will that felt like tearing his own soul in two, Valerian rejected it. He reforged his mental bastion not with blind faith, but with a conscious, chosen ignorance. Some truths were not meant to be known. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. His purity was not a lack of knowledge but a defense against it. He met Xyrath's burning gaze across the sanctum, his own psychic presence solidifying into a single, unbreakable statement. I want nothing you have. The psychic duel reached its crescendo, a silent, titanic struggle of opposing wills, the fate of the world hanging in the balance between a demon's infinite cunning and a man's finite, unshakable truth. The psychic stalemate shattered. Xyrath, his offers of glory and knowledge scorned, unleashed his fury in a tangible wave of obliterating force. The demon prince's form swelled, his shadow stretching to consume the entire sanctum, his single eye burning with a light that promised the end of all things. A spear of pure black energy coalesced in his clawed hand, a weapon forged from the distilled hatred of the warp, aimed directly at Valerian's heart. The brother-captain braced, his own psychic shields flaring to their absolute limit, knowing they would not be enough. This was not a blow to be blocked, only endured. The sanctum itself seemed to hold its breath, the very air crystallizing with the imminence of the killing strike. It was then that Initiate Kalen moved. He was not at Valerian's side, where the defensive formation had placed him. While the titans of will had clashed, his gaze had been fixed, not on the demon prince, but on the pulsating, chaotic core of the ritual nexus behind him, a writhing knot of stolen souls and warp energy that fed the rift and anchored Xyrath to the material world. The corrupting touch on his leg was a frozen brand of agony, a constant whisper urging him to kneel, to submit. But in that moment, he did not fight the pain. He embraced it. He accepted the cold fire as the final, clarifying truth of his duty. He saw the geometry of the moment with a stunning, terrible clarity. Valerian was the only one who could land a blow against the demon prince, but he was pinned, his power focused entirely on survival. The ritual nexus was the key, a volatile, unstable construct. To disrupt it would be to shatter Xyrath's anchor, to create the single, fleeting moment of vulnerability Valerian needed. There was no hesitation, no grand farewell. Kalen's decision was an atomic event, born and executed in the space between heartbeats. He channeled every ounce of his psychic might, not into a weapon or a shield, but into his own life force. His silver armor blazed with a light so pure it hurt to look upon, a final, defiant negation of the corruption seeping through his veins. He became a living projectile, a comet of sanctified will aimed at the heart of the blasphemy. He crossed the sanctum in a blur of incandescent motion, a silver streak against the encroaching dark, and plunged directly into the seething mass of the ritual nexus. The impact was silent, and then it was everything. There was no explosion of flesh and metal, but a cataclysm of spirit. Kalen's soul, focused to a single, blinding point of self-annihilating purity, detonated within the demonic construct. It was the ultimate antithesis, a star of order igniting in a sea of chaos. The nexus did not break, it screamed. The writhing knot of energy convulsed, its chaotic pattern seizing as the absolute law of Kalen's sacrifice imposed itself. The torrent of souls stuttered. Warp rift flickered, its edges blurring and bleeding color like a dying eye. For Xyrath, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The constant stream of power that fed his manifestation was severed. His form, a moment ago a monument of invincible malice, wavered, the solidity bleeding from his limbs. The spear of black energy in his hand dissolved into motes of fading shadow. His single, burning eye widened in a flash of shock and incandescent rage, the rage of a god cheated at the moment of its apotheosis. He was untethered, vulnerable. It was the opening Valerian needed. Freed from the onslaught of the demon prince's full attention, he did not charge. He took a single, grounding step forward, his two-handed grip on Argent Vindicta tightening. He did not see Xyrath as a god or a monster in that moment, but as a flaw in the universe, an error to be corrected. He poured every ounce of his being, his grief, his resolve, and his unwavering purpose into the blade. The sword flared, no longer merely glowing, but becoming a solid beam of silver light, so bright it cast no shadow. With a final, silent litany of banishment etched into his soul, he thrust. The blade did not simply pierce the demon prince's chest, it unraveled him. It was a negation, a command of non-existence delivered with the full authority of the Imperium's hidden guardians. Xyrath's form did not bleed. It came apart, dissolving into a howling vortex of dissipating energy that was sucked back into the faltering rift, his final, silent scream lost to the grinding gears of reality reasserting themselves. As the last of the demon prince faded, Valerian's gaze fell upon the spot where Kalen had made his stand. There was no body, no scorched mark on the floor. Where the initiate had been, a single, lingering afterimage of pure, silver light hovered for a heartbeat, a soul unburdened, cleansed of all pain and corruption, its purpose fulfilled. It was a moment of tragic, breathtaking heroism that encapsulated the Grey Knight's endless war, a life of secrecy, a death of anonymity, a sacrifice known only to the brothers who fought beside him and the emperor he served. The young initiate had not just saved his captain, he had reforged the very meaning of their duty in an act of ultimate selflessness. The sanctum fell into a trembling, unstable quiet. The rift still swirled above them, a gaping wound in the world, but it was destabilized, its edges fraying, its light dimmed. The constant, psychic hum had become a dissonant, fading whine. It was not closed. It was wounded, bleeding reality back into the immaterium, but it remained. The beast was banished, but its lair was still intact. The sacrifice had bought them a victory, but not the final one. The purgation was not yet complete. The silence that followed the demon prince's banishment was a fragile, trembling thing, a held breath in a body moments from death. The sanctum groaned, its structure strained by the violent reassertion of physics. Above them, the warp rift still churned, a wounded but open eye staring into the abyss. It pulsed erratically, its light dimmed but its presence a festering threat. Brother-Captain Valerian stood amidst the fading echoes of Kalen's sacrifice, the ghost of the young initiate's final, pure light imprinted on his soul. There was no time for grief, no moment for silent eulogies. The battle was won, but the war for the sector's survival had reached its final, most terrible stage. The rift was destabilized, but it was not closed. It was a bleeding artery, and while it remained, the daemonic could yet return, stronger, angrier. Valerian's gaze swept across his remaining battle brothers. Their silver armor was scarred, tarnished by ichor and etched with the psychic backlash of their ordeal. They stood as pillars of weary resolve, their minds a unified bastion awaiting his command. He met each of their helmed gazes in turn, a silent communication passing between them. Thuron gave a single, grim nod. The hope for a clean victory, for a redemption snatched from the jaws of damnation, had died with Kalen in that blinding flash of light. All that remained was necessity. Valerian turned from the shuddering rift and activated the long-range Voxcaster on his armor. The channel to the sanctuary of light, held in high anchor, hissed with static born of the Empyrean interference. His voice, when it came, was not the thunder of a warrior, but the cold, measured tone of an executioner pronouncing sentence. He did not request, he declared. The code phrase was a string of high Gothic syllables, each one a weight of absolute authority. It was the final verdict, the last word in a trial that had condemned an entire world. The order for exterminatus. His armored fingers moved across the data slate integrated into his vambrace, inputting the final authorization ciphers. The process was chillingly mundane, a sequence of numbers and runes that belied the cataclysm they would unleash. There was no grand lever to pull, no ceremonial button. It was an administrative act, a bureaucrat's gesture that would end a biosphere. The final cipher was accepted. A confirmation rune glowed a soft, unwavering green on his display. The deed was done. High above, in the cold, silent void, the sanctuary of light obeyed. Its lance batteries, vast and silent until this moment, swiveled with ancient hydraulic grace. They glowed from within, gathering unimaginable energies, becoming for a moment miniature stars in the darkness. Then they spoke. Beams of incandescent light, hotter than the heart of a sun, lanced down through the atmosphere. They did not strike the hive spire or the city. They struck the planet itself. The first impacts were silent from the surface, but the effects were immediate and biblical. The horizon ignited. A wall of fire, thousands of kilometers wide, raced across the face of Viridia, turning continents to ash and oceans to superheated steam. The very air began to burn, the sky transforming from a bruised purple to a hellish, uniform orange. The gray knights stood on the edge of the sanctum, their forms silhouetted against the burgeoning inferno. They watched in absolute silence as the world burned. There were no words to be spoken, no litany that could sanctify this act. This was not a purging flame of faith, but the cold, sterile fire of absolute annihilation. They watched forests that had stood for millennia vanish in an instant, mountain ranges melt and flow like wax, cities of millions become glowing pools of slag. The sight was a physical pressure against their senses, a horror that transcended the demonic. This was the work of their own hands, a necessary atrocity committed to save a sector from a fate infinitely worse. It was the ultimate expression of their duty, to bear the guilt of 1 billion deaths so that trillions might live in ignorance of the threat. They stood unmoving as Viridia died, its death scream a silent, expanding fireball that consumed the sky, a permanent scar on their souls and a secret they would carry to their own graves. The silence aboard the sanctuary of light was a different creature from the one they had left behind on Viridia. It was not the predatory hush of a world waiting to die, but the heavy, exhausted quiet that follows a storm of unimaginable violence. The ship itself seemed to groan with relief, its gellar field now holding back only the placid, hypnotic currents of the warp, the Imperial tempest having spent its fury. In the Medici Bay, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, sanctified unguents, and the ozone-tinged aroma of expended psychic energy. The Grey Knights tended to their wounds with the same ritualistic precision they applied to war. Their scarred Aegis armor lay in pieces on sanctified racks, revealing the transhuman flesh beneath, bruised, burned, and in some places, etched with faint, shadowy patterns where demonic essence had sought to take root. Apothecaries moved between them, their nartheciums humming as they administered counteragents and regenerative serums, their work a silent battle against the lingering taint of the Empyrean. Brother-Captain Valerian sat on an examination slab, his own armor removed, his torso a roadmap of freshly sealed scars and darkening bruises. The physical pain was a distant thing, a mere echo of the deeper wound carved into his spirit. His mind kept returning to the blinding flash of silver light, the moment of Kaelin's apotheosis. He saw it not as a failure, but as a validation, a stark, beautiful reminder of the purity their entire order was built upon. The initiate's sacrifice had been the fulcrum upon which their victory had turned, a single, perfect act of will that had outweighed the collective malice of a demon prince. It was a lesson written in soul fire, one that every Grey Knight understood but few had the privilege of witnessing so directly. When the last wound was dressed and the last trace of corruption purged, the squad assembled in the ship's small, stark chapel. It was a windowless room, Its only features a simple black marble altar and a single, eternal flame that burned with unwavering silver light. There were no chaplains, no choirs, no grand litanies broadcast across the vessel. This ceremony was for them alone. They stood in a circle around the flame, their faces bare, their expressions granite masks of shared grief and resolve. Valerian did not speak of Kaelin's bravery or his potential. Such things were irrelevant. Instead, he focused his psychic presence, and one by one the brothers added their own. Together, they recreated the moment, not the death, but the release. They built a shared psychic memorial of that final, brilliant flare of untainted spirit, the moment Kaelin's soul had shaken off the dust of mortality and returned to the Emperor's light, utterly pure and forever free. It was not a lament. It was an affirmation. They honored him by reaffirming the value of his sacrifice, by accepting its terrible necessity, and by steeling themselves to demand it again should duty require. The ceremony ended as it began, in silence, the memory of that silver light now a permanent part of their collective soul. The sanctuary of light sailed on, a sliver of order in the formless chaos of the warp. Its course was set for Titan, for the hidden fortress and the resumption of the endless vigil. Their victory was absolute, their mission a success. A demon prince was banished, a nascent demon world incinerated, a sector saved from an eternity of torment. And yet, no chronicles would record their deeds. No scribes would illuminate their names on vellum. No grateful populace would raise statues in their honor. The victory on Veridia would be logged in Imperial archives as a tragic, unexplained exterminatus due to systemic planetary rebellion or a catastrophic reactor failure, a convenient lie to bury a terrifying truth. Their triumph was a secret, known only to the 8 warriors in the chapel, the crew sworn to silence, and the silent, watching emperor on his golden throne. They were the keepers of terrible knowledge, the bearers of unbearable burdens, their greatest victories forever shrouded in the very shadows they fought. The ship pressed on, carrying its silent, silver guardians home, their deeds another hidden stone in the foundation of an imperium that would never know their names. The cell on Titan was a sanctuary of perfect, engineered silence. The adamantium walls, thick enough to withstand a direct lance strike, were also psychically inert, creating a void where the constant, screaming pressure of the Empyrean could not reach. Brother-Captain Valerian stood at its center, his aegis armor removed and resting on its rack, its silver plates gleaming dully in the low, ambient light. He was alone, truly alone, for the first time since the summons had shattered his vigil. The air was cold and still, carrying only the faint, clean scent of ozone and polished stone. He closed his eyes, and the images he had fought so hard to suppress during the mission now rose unbidden, not as phantoms to be battled, but as truths to be absorbed. He saw the cycle with a clarity that was both a burden and a strength. The psychic tremor, the summons, the journey through the screaming dark, the descent into a world already damned, the clash of silver against the unreal, and finally, the cold, administrative act of planetary death. It was a wheel that had turned for 10,000 years, and he was but one spoke in its eternal revolution. He felt the weight of countless unspoken victories pressing upon him, a mountain of silent heroism and necessary atrocity. Each world saved was a tombstone in a hidden graveyard, each demon banished a secret locked within the vault of his mind. The Grey Knights were the Imperium's hidden ledger, their triumphs recorded not in ink, but in the scars on their souls. And the silent, burning death of worlds like Veridia. His thoughts turned to Kaelin. The initiate's sacrifice was not a unique tragedy, but a recurring feature of their duty. He had been one of countless bright, promising souls who had burned themselves out in a flash of purifying light, so that the darkness could be held at bay for one more day. Valerian carried the memory of them all, a constellation of extinguished stars that guided his path through the endless night. This was the profound isolation of his duty. He had stood on the surface of a dying world and input the codes for its destruction. He had looked into the heart of a demon prince and rejected its temptations. He had felt the soul of a brother flare into nothingness for a cause that would never be known. These were experiences that set him apart from all of humanity, even from the other warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. They knew war. He knew the enemy behind the war, the sentient malevolence that fed on conflict and despair. He opened his eyes, his gaze falling upon the blank wall of his cell. In its featureless surface, he saw reflected the abyss he was sworn to oppose. It was not a place, but a state of being, a cosmic hunger that would never be sated, a tide that would never fully recede. To know it, to truly comprehend its scale and its patience, was to live in a state of perpetual, solitary vigilance. There was no final victory to be won, no grand, concluding battle. There was only the stand. The eternal, unwavering stand against the encroaching nothingness. And in that moment, surrounded by the crushing weight of his knowledge and the ghosts of his victories, Valerian's resolve did not waver, it crystallized. The solitude was not a curse, but a weapon. It was the necessary distance that allowed him to see the threat with absolute clarity, unclouded by the hopes and fears of those he protected. The isolation was the forge in which his will was tempered, the silent space where his purpose was reaffirmed. He was a warden of a border that most of humanity did not know existed. He was the shield in the shadows, the fire that burned in the dark to keep the night at bay. He would stand here, in this cell and on 1,000 other battlefields, forever vigilant. For in the face of the infinite, silent abyss, the only appropriate answer was an infinite, silent watch. The summons came not as a chime, but as a cold, familiar pressure against his soul, a psychic ripple in the serene stillness of his cell. It was a sensation as intimate and unwelcome as a remembered pain, the herald of a new wound in reality that demanded his specific, purifying touch. Brother-Captain Valerian's eyes opened, the deep meditation shattered. The silent communion with his own resolve was over, the cycle was beginning anew. He rose, his bare feet feeling the icy bite of the stone floor, a grounding sensation before he stepped back into the fire. There was no hesitation, no moment of weary reluctance. Summons was the only reason for his existence, the perpetual alarm that governed the rhythm of his life. He moved to the armor rack where his Aegis armor stood, a silent, silver sentinel in the gloom. Each piece was a relic, a testament to a life of purity, power, and perpetual sacrifice. He began the ritual of donning it, his movements economical and practiced. The first piece was the greave, its ceramite cool against his skin. As he secured it, he felt the latent psychic energy within the warded plates begin to stir, a sleeping giant awakening to his touch. Next came the vambraces and gauntlets, each inscribed with litanies of protection that glimmered with a soft, internal light as they locked into place. With each piece, the weight of his duty settled more firmly upon him, not as a burden, but as an integral part of his being. The chest plate, emblazoned with the heraldry of his brotherhood, sealed with a final, resonant click, its power core humming to life and syncing with his own. Biorhythms. Finally, he lifted his helmet. The silver skull stared back at him, its blank eyes a promise of the anonymity and secrecy that defined his order. He placed it over his head, the world vanishing for a moment before the retinal display flickered to life, overlaying tactical data and psychic readings onto his vision. A soft hiss signaled the hermetic seal, and the cell's sterile air was replaced by the filtered, ozone-scented atmosphere of his armor's life support. He was no longer a man in a quiet room, he was a weapon, encased in sanctified silver and unyielding resolve. He was a gray night and the shadows were calling once more. He did not know the specifics of the threat, only its location and its dire nature. The summons had carried a single, chilling datum, a potential incursion, alarmingly close to terror itself. The heart of the Imperium. The thought was a cold shard in his gut. A breach so near the throne world was unthinkable, a catastrophe that dwarfed even the horror of Veridia. It meant the enemy was probing the very core of human space, its tendrils reaching for the throat of mankind. This was not a frontier purge, it was a defense of the sanctum. He stood for a final moment in the center of his cell, a silver giant poised on the edge of action. He embodied the eternal struggle of his chapter, a life lived in the absolute clarity of purpose, wielding power that could level cities, yet bound by an oath of silence that buried their deeds in the dust of forgotten worlds. It was a life of purity, maintained through constant war against the most insidious corruption. It was a life of power, channeled solely for the act of negation and protection. And above all, it was a life of perpetual sacrifice, where every victory was paid for in the blood of brothers, and the silent, soul-scarring guilt of being the one who had to choose which worlds would burn. The summons pulsed again, more insistent this time. The vigil was over. The watch had begun. Valerian turned, the door to his cell sliding open, and stepped out into the corridor, ready to face the horrors anew, a sliver of silver light descending once more into the waiting dark.